Renee Carson walked into the sleek, modern lobby of Bradford Keenan and Associates with a quiet confidence that only years of experience could provide. At 43, with a career built on strategic marketing and high-level campaigns for Fortune 500 companies, she had every reason to feel sure of herself. Her resume was airtight, her references impeccable, and her posture as she walked into the building spoke volumes. The soft click of her heels on the polished floor echoed through the otherwise silent space, her navy blazer sharp and her leather folder in hand. An image of professionalism. What Renee didn't know, as she stood there preparing herself for the most important interview of her life, was that her entire world had changed without her knowledge. Her husband, Julian, had recently acquired Bradford Keenan and Associates, but he hadn't told anyone, not even the employees. He was watching the entire situation unfold from his office on the top floor, unseen, quiet and calculating. Renee had taken a 2-year break from her career to care for her ailing father, and now, as she prepared to re-enter the workforce, she wasn't just looking for a job. She was looking for a place where her skills, expertise, and presence would be valued. This wasn't just another interview. It was her chance to prove to herself that she could still thrive in the corporate world. Unbeknownst to her, this interview would be more than just a routine hiring process. It would become the very moment where the tables turned, a moment that would challenge the company's deeply ingrained biases and test the authenticity of its leadership. But at this point, Renee had no idea that this was only the beginning of a much larger story, one that would reshape her future in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Renee took a deep breath as she stepped into the interview room, her confidence still intact despite the chilling atmosphere that seemed to hang in the air. The sleek, impersonal design of the office gave nothing away. The walls were stark white, the lighting harsh and unforgiving. The modern art scattered around the room didn't evoke creativity or inspiration. Instead, it added to the sense of sterility, as if everything was calculated, everything was detached. She could almost feel the coldness seeping through the marble floors and glass windows, seeping into her very bones. She walked up to the reception desk, greeted with nothing more than a fleeting, distracted glance from the receptionist. Her expression was unreadable, like she had seen countless faces like Renee's before, perhaps too many. "Good morning. I'm here for the 10 a.m. interview with Elaine Beckman," Renee said, trying to sound warm, attempting to infuse the words with kindness. But the receptionist barely looked up. Renee's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered, forcing the calm composure she had spent years perfecting. "Renee Carson," she said again, offering her name with a steady voice. The receptionist hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she glanced at Renee with mild confusion, almost as if she was surprised anyone would show up for the interview at all. The receptionist muttered something under her breath, then made a quick call, her tone dropping to a near whisper. Renee could feel the gaze that followed her every move, the subtle judgment in the air, but she didn't let it show. She thanked the receptionist and sat down in the waiting area, her back straight, her hands tightly gripping the leather folder in her lap. Minutes dragged by, each tick of the clock louder than the last. The silence felt suffocating. No other candidates arrived, no employees rushed about, no sense of urgency in the air, just cold, sterile quiet. Finally, a man in a dark suit appeared from behind a frosted glass door. His face showed a flicker of surprise when he laid eyes on her, but it wasn't a warm welcome. No smile, no handshake, just a quick nod. "Renee Carson?" he asked in a tone that was more of an observation than a question. "Yes," she replied, standing up, her voice steady but her heart racing. Devin Marks, the director of marketing, didn't offer a greeting or a word of small talk. He didn't ask how her drive was or if she was comfortable. Instead, he simply turned and walked down the hallway, his shoes squeaking on the floor as she followed behind him. The tension palpable in the air between them and the meeting room. Elaine Beckman sat at the table, her eyes barely lifting from her laptop. She didn't stand to greet Renee. Instead, she peered over her glasses, her lips barely moving as she muttered, "Let's get started." The questions came fast and sharp, lacking warmth, lacking any sense of genuine curiosity. They weren't meant to understand her qualifications. They were meant to undermine her, to question her very right to be there. "Are you sure this is the role you applied for?" Elaine asked, raising an eyebrow as if Renee had made some mistake. Renee's breath caught in her chest. The sharpness in Elaine's voice made her stomach tighten, but she held steady. "Yes, I'm sure," she replied, forcing the words out with a confidence she didn't feel. The questions kept coming, each one digging deeper, questioning her experience, her qualifications, her gap in employment to care for her father. Why the 2-year gap? Elaine pressed, her tone not one of concern but of accusation. Renee felt the weight of each word. It wasn't an interview, it was an interrogation. Each question was a barrier, an obstacle, a challenge not to her skills but to her very worth. The longer she sat there, the more she could feel the doors of opportunity closing in on her. Despite her preparation, despite her confidence, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Just when she thought it couldn't get worse, Devin closed his notebook and looked at her with almost disinterested eyes. "Actually, it looks like there's been a miscommunication," he said. "This position was filled internally last night. Apologies for the inconvenience." The words hit like a slap. Renee's mind went blank. She couldn't process what was happening. Had she just wasted her time? She hadn't even gotten the chance to fully speak, to show them what she was capable of, and they were already dismissing her no handshake. "No thank you." Just a cold gesture toward the door as she walked out of the meeting room. The receptionist, once again, ignored her presence, her eyes glued to the phone. Renee's pulse quickened as she made her way back to the elevator. The silence in the building was deafening, and for the first time, she felt truly invisible. Renee settled into the chair across from Elaine Beckman, trying to keep her posture straight and her nerves in check. She had anticipated a challenging interview. After all, the role she was vying for was significant. But she hadn't expected the hostility that seemed to drip from every word Elaine spoke. The first few questions seemed routine, but there was something off about the way they were asked. The tone was sharp, like the interviewer was already doubting her before she even opened her mouth. "Are you sure this is the role you applied for?" Elaine asked, looking at Renee through the thin lenses of her glasses. There was no warmth in the voice, no curiosity, just a sense of disbelief, as if Renee had made some sort of mistake. Renee blinked, momentarily stunned. "Yes, I'm sure," she said, her voice steady despite the question cutting through her like a blade. She wasn't sure if she was being questioned about her qualifications or just about her presence in the room. But there was no time to linger on that thought. She could feel the interview slipping away from her. Elaine didn't let it go. "This position is very demanding," she said, her gaze fixed on Renee, as though she were inspecting a rare object she wasn't entirely sure how to value. "How familiar are you with client-facing tech?" Renee hesitated, surprised by the lack of a warm-up, a simple, "Tell us about your experience." Instead, it was a straight challenge, as if she were unqualified from the start. I have experience managing multiple tech-driven projects for international clients, Renee responded, keeping her tone calm, but she could feel her heart rate quicken. Elaine raised an eyebrow. International from where exactly? She asked, her voice dripping with skepticism. Renee's breath caught. Singapore, Toronto, Frankfurt, she replied, her mind racing for the specific examples she had prepared for the interview. Elaine pursed her lips, as if the answer was somehow insufficient. She glanced at her notes, clearly uninterested in the real substance of Renee's experience. And the 2-year gap in your resume. Why don't you tell us about that? The question hit harder than Renee expected. It wasn't an inquiry about skills or achievements. It was an accusation, as if the 2 years she had spent caring for her terminally ill father was a strike against her. It felt personal, the kind of judgment that cuts deep. I took time off to care for my father, Renee said, the words coming out quieter than she intended. It was a family emergency. I don't apologize for that. She forced herself to meet Elaine's eyes, but Elaine didn't respond with empathy. Instead, she just nodded dismissively, scribbling something on her notepad. Right? Her voice was a flat line. Let's move on. Renee's stomach twisted. She was being dismissed not as a candidate, but as a person. The weight of the disrespect was palpable. Each question a jab, each answer more uncertain than the last. She could feel the room closing in, the air growing thick with tension. The woman sitting across from her wasn't trying to understand her. She was testing her, poking holes, looking for any reason to disqualify her. The interview had barely lasted 15 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. The coldness in the room had seeped into Renee's very being. The questions had been sharp, dismissive, and deliberately probing, but none had given her the chance to truly showcase the experience she had spent years building. The silence that followed each response was deafening, and the atmosphere had slowly turned from uncomfortable to suffocating. Devin Marks, who had been flipping through his notebook while Renee spoke, closed it with an abrupt snap. His gaze met hers, but there was no empathy, no recognition of her qualifications, just indifference. He didn't speak for a moment, letting the tension hang in the air like a thick fog. Renee's pulse quickened. Was this it? Was she being judged so harshly, so quickly? It didn't make sense. She was more than qualified. Her career spoke for itself. Finally, Devin broke the silence. His voice was flat, almost rehearsed. Actually, he said, looking down at his notes as though he had lost interest in her completely, it looks like there's been a miscommunication. Renee's heart dropped. Miscommunication? What did that even mean? He looked up briefly, meeting her gaze, but the look was fleeting. This position was filled internally last night, he continued. Apologies for the inconvenience. Renee's throat tightened. Her mind raced, trying to process the words. It didn't make sense. Why was she even here? Why hadn't anyone bothered to let her know that the role was no longer available before wasting her time? The feeling of betrayal swept over her like a cold wave. She had prepared for this moment for months. She had put her heart into it, and yet here she was, dismissed with nothing more than a brief, uncaring statement. She opened her mouth to speak, to protest, to ask for an explanation, but the words got stuck. What was there to say? Everything about the interview had been wrong, from the condescending questions to the blatant disregard for her expertise. The idea of fighting for this job, for this company, seemed suddenly futile. Before she could find her voice, Elaine Beckman, who had been sitting silently with her eyes on the laptop the whole time, added, "We'll keep your resume on file." The words were as hollow as the smile she forced. No handshake. No, thank you for your time. No acknowledgement that Renee had just been subjected to a 15-minute grilling for a position that wasn't even available. It was all so calculated, so cold. Renee stood up, her legs feeling like they were made of stone. She walked toward the door, each step heavy, echoing in the sterile silence of the room. As she passed the receptionist, there was no sign of recognition, no parting words, The receptionist didn't even look up. Renee didn't expect anything different, but somehow, it hurt even more. The elevator doors opened with a soft ping, and she stepped inside, her hands gripping the edge of the leather folder. The smooth, metallic sound of the doors closing was the final, deafening note in a symphony of cold indifference. As the elevator began its descent, Renee closed her eyes, fighting back the sting of humiliation. It wasn't the job she had wanted. It wasn't the respect she had hoped for. That it was nothing. Julian sat still in his office, his back straight, his hands clasped behind him. He had been watching everything unfold on the screen in front of him, unseen, silent, observing. The live audio feed, the hidden cameras, the slight shifts in body language, it all played out like a slow-motion car crash. But it wasn't just the way Renee had been treated that bothered him. It was the underlying current of bias, the sharp edges of discrimination that cut through every question, every look, every dismissive gesture. His gaze remained fixed on the screen, his jaw clenched tight. He'd seen this before. The condescension, the subtle undermining, the assumptions made based solely on someone's gender, appearance, and, in Renee's case, the 2-year gap on her resume. A gap that, if anyone had bothered to ask, was filled with love, sacrifice, and a personal commitment to family. But that hadn't mattered to them. What mattered was how they saw her, how they immediately categorized her as an outsider, as someone who didn't belong in the room. He leaned forward slightly, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the edge of his desk. Devon's dismissive tone, Elaine's raised eyebrows, and the way they had closed the conversation before Renee could even finish speaking. It was all too familiar, too calculated. He had seen it in countless other companies, in different meetings, in different cities, but it was the same thing every time. The same people being overlooked, disregarded, pushed aside, simply because they didn't fit the mold that executives like Devon and Elaine found comfortable. Julian's mind worked quickly, analyzing what he had just witnessed. This wasn't a simple case of miscommunication or a poor hiring process. This was systematic. It was deep-seated in the culture of the company. A culture of exclusivity, of favoring those who were the same, who were comfortable. A culture that looked at someone like Renee, a highly qualified professional, and instead of valuing her experience, reduced her to a 2-year gap in her employment history. It was the same old story of comfort bias, of people in power surrounding themselves with others who looked like them, came from the same places, and attended the same schools. He took a deep breath, letting the realization settle in. This was more than just a bad interview. This was a reflection of an entire system that needed to be changed. The company's lack of diversity in its leadership had become glaringly obvious, and Renee's treatment had just confirmed it. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he typed a few quick commands. He wouldn't just sit back and let this go unnoticed. The power dynamics in this building were about to shift, and he wasn't going to allow the company he now owned to continue perpetuating this kind of culture. He pressed send on the email, knowing it would set off a chain of events that would change everything. And as he sat there, staring out at the Austin skyline, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger. Something that would force everyone in that building to confront their biases, whether they were ready to or not. Julian sat at his desk, the city of Austin sprawling beneath him, the midday sun reflecting off the glass windows. He had seen enough. The interview had been a wake-up call, one that reverberated through his mind, shaking him to the core. He had always known that corporate cultures could be toxic, but this was something different. This was systemic. This was a pattern, years in the making, that he could no longer ignore. The silence in his office was deafening as he stared at the screen, the video of Renee's interview replaying in his mind. The condescending questions, the dismissive tone, the quick dismissal. All of it was a clear indication that the company's hiring practices were not just flawed. They were fundamentally biased. He had witnessed firsthand how qualified individuals, particularly those from underrepresented backgrounds, were being pushed aside before they could even demonstrate their worth. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, his mind racing. He wasn't just a passive observer anymore. He was the CEO now, and this was his company. He had the power to make things right. The thought of that power both invigorated and unsettled him. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Change never was. But he also knew that he couldn't allow this culture to fester under his watch. Not after what he had seen. With a decisive click, he pulled up the internal records, scrolling through hiring data, interview logs, and memos. The patterns were glaring. A lack of diversity at the senior level. A history of hiring the same type of person, highly educated, from specific zip codes from the same network. It was all so predictable, so comfortable, and that comfort had bred a bias that no one had been willing to challenge. Julian leaned back in his chair, the weight of the task ahead sinking in. He had to do more than just fill a diversity quota. This needed to be a complete overhaul. He would implement a thorough review of every hiring decision made over the past 5 years. All of it. The candidates who had been overlooked. The ones who had been dismissed with a simple, not the right fit. The ones who had been judged not by their merit, but by the invisible barriers set up by outdated, discriminatory practices. His mind was already working, formulating a plan. The first step was clear: meet with HR and the board, make them aware of the changes he intended to bring. Then it was time to break the silence, to call out the biases and remove the old guard. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. The culture needed to change, and it needed to change now. He stood up, his gaze still fixed on the horizon, a fire igniting within him. This was his moment. The company would either grow, evolve, and embrace the future, or it would be left behind, stuck in the past. And Julian wasn't the type of person to leave anyone behind. Not on his watch. Renee's footsteps echoed in the empty hallway as she made her way to the elevator, each step heavier than the last. The sharp, sterile silence that surrounded her felt suffocating, as if the building itself was closing in, pressing down on her, reminding her of just how small she had been made to feel. Her mind was a blur of disbelief, her thoughts racing to catch up with the reality of what had just unfolded. She had walked into that interview with nothing but confidence and hope. She had spent days, weeks even, preparing for this moment, ready to prove to herself that she was still capable, that her years away from the workforce hadn't dulled her sharpness. But now, as she stood in the cold metallic box of the elevator, she wasn't angry. No, she wasn't angry at all. Instead, there was something far worse creeping in, the heavy, crushing weight of abandonment. A deep, aching sadness, like someone had looked at her and seen nothing but an inconvenience, a problem to be dismissed. Was this what she was worth? She wondered. Was she just the woman who had taken time off to care for a dying parent, a footnote in the story of her own career? The question stung in ways she hadn't expected. She had always prided herself on her resilience, her ability to come back stronger. But now, standing alone in that elevator, she wondered if they had seen her at all. Or had they only seen the 2-year gap in her resume? Had they dismissed all she had accomplished, all she had given, simply because of that? The elevator doors slid open, and she stepped into the parking garage, her heart heavy, her mind still reeling. She had been ready for a challenge. She had been ready for a tough interview, for probing questions that tested her limits. But this was something entirely different. This was personal. This was bias, plain and simple. And it wasn't about qualifications, it was about comfort, about who she was and what she represented. She reached her car and paused, her hand hovering over the door handle. For a moment, everything seemed still, frozen in time. And then, in that quiet moment of reflection, something shifted and no more. She wasn't going to let this define her. She wasn't going to let the small-minded judgments of 2 people rob her of her worth. Renee knew who she was. She knew what she could do, and it wasn't up to them to decide her future. With a deep, steadying breath, Renee opened the car door and slid into the driver's seat. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, but this time it wasn't out of frustration. It was determination. She would not be overlooked again. Julian stood in front of the expansive windows of his office, staring out at the sprawling city below. The weight of the decision ahead pressed heavily on his chest. He had known, deep down, that changes needed to be made. But now, seeing the reality of how the company operated, he could no longer ignore the systemic issues that ran deep within its walls. He was the CEO now, and it was time for him to act. No more sitting in silence. No more turning a blind eye. He checked the time. The meeting with HR and the executives was about to begin. As he entered the conference room, his gaze immediately fell on the faces of the executives gathered around the polished oak table. They shifted uncomfortably under his stare, sensing the tension that was building in the room. His presence, commanding and unwavering, made the atmosphere even more suffocating. Julian wasn't here for pleasantries. He wasn't here to play the part of a leader who was content to sit idly by while inequality festered. He was here to address something that could no longer be ignored. "Take a seat," he said calmly, but his voice cut through the air like a blade. There was no warmth in it, no pretense, just the cold reality of what was about to unfold. The room fell into an unnatural silence as the executives reluctantly took their seats. Julian stood at the head of the table, eyes flicking from face to face, assessing, calculating. His gaze stopped on Elaine Beckman and Devin Marks, the two responsible for Renee's humiliating interview. He knew the truth, and he knew they did too. "I watched the interview," Julian began, his voice steady but carrying an undeniable edge. "I saw how you treated her. The condescending questions, the dismissive tone, the complete lack of respect. Tell me, what exactly did you think you were doing?" Elaine's face turned pale, and Devin shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly aware of the gravity of the situation. Neither spoke immediately, but the silence only made the tension thicker. Devin stammered, but Julian cut him off, his eyes narrowing. "No excuses," he said, his voice low but sharp. "I've been reviewing the hiring processes, the patterns, the history, and I've seen enough. This isn't about a single incident. This is about a culture of exclusion, of bias, of treating qualified candidates like obstacles to be discarded because they don't fit your comfort zone." He paused, letting the words sink in, watching their reactions carefully. Elaine looked down, her face flushed, while Devin seemed to shrink back, suddenly aware of how vulnerable his position was. "You're being given the opportunity to explain yourselves," Julian continued, his gaze now piercing. "Explain why a highly qualified candidate, someone who has worked with international clients, someone with years of experience, was treated like she didn't belong in this company." There was a long, uncomfortable silence. No one dared to speak. "I've already made my decision," Julian said, the finality in his voice unmistakable. "This is a wake-up call. The company is going through a complete restructure. From this moment on, our hiring practices will be completely overhauled. Every decision you've made, every candidate you've dismissed will be reviewed. No one will be above scrutiny." His words hung heavy in the air, the weight of his determination unmistakable. This wasn't just a reprimand. This was the beginning of a new era. An era where inclusion and fairness would no longer be optional but expected. Effective immediately, Julian concluded, "Your names will not be on the next press release about the leadership transition. Your positions are under review." The room was silent, the executives frozen, their eyes wide with shock. Julian's gaze remained unwavering, and for the first time in a long while, the executives understood the true power of leadership. It wasn't just about making decisions, it was about making the right ones. And Julian had just made his. The silence in the boardroom was deafening. Julian's words hung in the air, thick with gravity. The executives, once so sure of their positions, now seemed to shrink beneath his gaze. The walls, once filled with the comfort of unchecked power, now felt like they were closing in around them. Julian's presence was commanding, unwavering, and for the first time, the room was acutely aware of just how precarious their positions had become. He stood tall, his gaze moving over each face at the table. Elaine Beckman, her face pale, her posture rigid. Devin Marks, his hand gripping the edge of the table, his fingers twitching nervously. The others were no better, visibly uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, avoiding eye contact. Julian wasn't here to negotiate or offer second chances. This was the moment of reckoning. "You've had your chance to speak," Julian said, his voice low but filled with authority. "And now we begin the real work. You have all been complicit in fostering a culture of exclusion and bias. I've seen it in your hiring decisions, in your treatment of candidates, and in the way you view anyone who doesn't fit your narrow definition of ideal. But that ends today. There was a palpable tension in the room as Julian's words sank in. No one dared to interrupt. "You will each be held accountable," he continued, his voice growing sharper. "I've requested a complete review of every hiring decision made in the last 5 years. Every resume, every interview, every person you've passed on. It will all be scrutinized. Every decision will be examined with one purpose: to uncover the bias that has been allowed to thrive unchecked." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over them. The look in his eyes told them everything they needed to know. There was no turning back now. The truth would come out. Those who have shown discrimination will no longer hold positions of power in this company. And I mean everyone, from the top down. Devon swallowed hard, but his voice caught in his throat as he opened his mouth to speak. Julian raised a hand, silencing him before he could form a single word. "Not a word, Devon. You've already said enough. Your actions have already shown who you are." Elaine shifted uncomfortably, her eyes downcast. She had expected some form of reprimand, but this was different. She had miscalculated, thinking she could brush Renee aside without consequence. But now, the entire company's future was hanging in the balance. "You will leave this room today with one clear message," Julian continued, his voice firm and resolute. "If you cannot recognize and eliminate your biases, if you cannot embrace diversity, you will not have a place here. There will be no room for those who don't align with the values of inclusion and respect we are about to build. If you are unwilling to change, then you will have no place in this new vision for the company." The tension in the room was almost unbearable now. The weight of Julian's words had struck each person like a punch to the gut, and they knew there was no way out. Their fates had been sealed. "Effective immediately," Julian said, his tone final. "The leadership team will undergo a complete restructure. You'll be hearing from HR. And for the rest of you," he added, turning his gaze to the room, "this is your warning. Either you are part of the solution or you are part of the problem. The time for complacency is over." As Julian turned to leave, he could feel the eyes of the room following him. The company was in the midst of a reckoning. Change was coming, and it was going to be swift, it was going to be necessary, and it was going to be relentless. The old guard had been exposed, and a new era was on the horizon. There would be no more silence, no more excuses. The company would change, or it would crumble under its own weight. And Julian was determined to make sure it did neither. Renee sat at her kitchen table, a mug of tea in front of her, the soft morning light filtering through the windows. The weight of the last few days was still fresh in her mind. The sting of the interview, the cold dismissal, and the painful realization that the company she had hoped to join wasn't a place where she could thrive. But rather than let the anger or bitterness take root, Renee had done something unexpected. She had made a choice to stop waiting for opportunities to be handed to her and to start creating her own. The idea had come to her quietly, almost as a whisper at first. After all, what had she been doing for years? Crafting stories, building brands, connecting people to purpose and passion. It wasn't just a career for her, it was a calling. And if the industry wouldn't recognize her talents, then she would build something that would. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she typed the words that had been swirling in her head. True North Strategies. A name that reflected her vision, her purpose. A name that would guide businesses towards authenticity and inclusion, helping brands craft compelling narratives while giving a voice to those who had been left out of the conversation for too long. She would focus on brand storytelling and consumer strategy, but there was something deeper in her mission. something that burned brighter than just profits and clients. She was determined to uplift underrepresented voices, to make sure those who had been marginalized in the industry had the chance to be heard. The vision was clear. She would use her skills, her network, and her experience to create a space where diversity wasn't just a checkbox to be ticked, but a core value. A place where people didn't have to fight for recognition, but where their stories were celebrated. She imagined businesses built on integrity and inclusivity, helping them reach their audience not by playing to the lowest common denominator, but by connecting on a deeper, more human level. Her phone buzzed with a message from Julian. "I'm proud of you. You've got this." The words brought a smile to her lips, a warmth to her chest. She had spent so much time doubting herself, but now she could feel the shift. This was her time. This was her new beginning. With a deep breath, Renee closed her laptop, standing up with renewed purpose. The road ahead would be difficult, but she was ready. She had found her true north, and now it was time to lead the way. The soft hum of the kettle broke the silence in their kitchen as Renee stood by the counter, staring out the window at the twilight sky. The last few days had been a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, sadness, disbelief, but also a quiet, simmering sense of clarity. Her hands gripped the edge of the counter as she took in a deep breath. She was ready. Julian entered the room, his steps slow and deliberate, his presence as calming as it was commanding. He had watched everything unfold, seen the raw emotion in her eyes when she walked away from that interview, and he had stood by her as she fought to reclaim her power. Now, the silence between them was different. It wasn't tense or heavy with unspoken words. It was a shared moment of reflection. Renee didn't turn to face him immediately, but she could feel his eyes on her, steady and unwavering. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but resolute. "I've been thinking," she began, her words almost a whisper, "about everything. The interview, the company, the way I was treated. And you know what? I don't need to prove my worth to anyone. Not to them. Not to anyone." Julian leaned against the doorframe, watching her closely. His heart ached for her, for the unfairness she had endured, but he also felt a deep sense of pride. Renee wasn't just his wife. She was fierce, intelligent, capable, and far beyond the limitations anyone tried to place on her. "I know," he said, his voice soft, but with a strength that only he could bring. "I've seen you work your whole life, Renee. I've seen you build careers, make things happen when no one else believed. You don't owe them anything." She turned to look at him now, her eyes shining with a mixture of vulnerability and newfound determination. "I'm ready, Julian, ready to start this new journey. I'm not going to let them, anyone, define what I can do. I'm going to build something on my own terms, something that truly matters." Julian stepped closer, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "And you will. You've always known exactly who you are. Now the world will see it too." She smiled, a small but powerful gesture. The weight she had carried for so long, the uncertainty, the frustration, began to lift. For the first time in a long while, she felt the freedom to move forward without fear, without doubt. She had her own path now. "I'm ready to lead, Julian," she said, her voice steady with conviction. "True North Strategies is just the beginning." Julian nodded, pride swelling in his chest. "And I'll be right here, every step of the way." Together, they stood in the quiet of the evening, knowing that the road ahead would be challenging, but also knowing that it was their road to travel. Renee stood by her window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance as she reflected on the journey she had just begun. It had been a whirlwind, a roller coaster of emotions and decisions. The job offer from Bradford Keenan had been tempting, but as she thought about it more, she realized it wasn't the opportunity she needed. It was the affirmation she had been seeking, a confirmation of her value. But the truth was clear. She didn't need anyone's approval to define her worth. She had always been driven by her passion for brand storytelling, her ability to help businesses craft narratives that resonated with their audiences. But now, her mission had grown beyond just creating compelling marketing campaigns. It was about empowering voices that had been overlooked, especially those from underrepresented communities. Renee was ready to make her own way, to start her own company, True North Strategies, and she wasn't waiting for anyone to give her permission. The offer from Bradford Keenan would have provided a steady paycheck, a role in a well-established company, but it wasn't her dream. It wasn't what she had envisioned for herself. She had been undervalued and dismissed by that company, and she wasn't about to walk back into a space that had shown her so little respect. As she sat at her desk, typing up the email to politely decline the offer, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Carla, one of the executives from the company. Carla had been one of the few who had reached out to Renee after her disheartening interview. Renee had always admired Carla's leadership, and now Carla's message was both an apology and an acknowledgement of the way things had been handled. I wanted to reach out and sincerely apologize for the way you were treated during your interview. What happened was unacceptable, and it wasn't a reflection of the caliber of talent you bring to the table. You are exactly the type of person we need, and I hope you can forgive the behavior that occurred. I've already recommended you for other opportunities in the industry. You don't need to wait for anyone's approval, but I want to make sure you know that you have my full support moving forward. Renee smiled as she read the message. It wasn't just an apology. It was a recognition of her talent and potential. It was exactly what she had been looking for, the respect she deserved. And while it wasn't the job offer she had expected, it was a sign that she was on the right path. The right people were noticing her, and she was beginning to feel the power of her own choices. The message had come at the perfect moment. It reinforced what she had known deep down. She didn't need to prove herself to anyone. She didn't need to conform to the expectations of a company that couldn't see her worth. She had the ability to define her own success, and that was far more valuable than any job title or paycheck. As she sat back in her chair, Renee realized that she had taken the first step towards her true potential. She was no longer waiting for someone else to validate her. She was carving out her own path, creating opportunities where there had been none. And that was the most empowering feeling of all. For those of you reading this, who may have felt overlooked or undervalued, Renee's story is a powerful reminder. You are worthy. You are capable. You don't need anyone's approval to succeed. Trust yourself, trust your journey, and take the leap. When you finally realize that your worth is intrinsic, you'll stop waiting for permission and start creating your own opportunities. And if you found inspiration in Renee's journey, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Join us as we continue to explore stories of resilience, success, and the lessons learned along the way. Stay tuned for more insights that could change your perspective and empower your own path. Because when you realize your worth, there's nothing stopping you.